Welcome to Talkcast and to episode 2 in my exploration or breakdown of The Myth of the Framework by Karl Popper. We have so far heard about fruitful discussions and how they are about learning. If two people or parties or groups or whatever it may be have even slightly or vastly different worldviews, they can encounter each other, exchange ideas and learn. And I would say have fun, as Popper says, encounter each other for the enjoyment of the discussion. Some may be persuaded throughout the course of any discussion they are wrong during that encounter, or they may not be. Learning might still happen even if no one is persuaded that the other is actually correct. Today, I'm not going to go through a long introduction, but perhaps to just set the scene, we'll let Joe Rogan and Saad, who recently spoke together, and in fact mentioned David Deutsch during their discussion, also talked about the purpose of discussion. And I thought this was thrilling. This was right in accord with what I'm doing here with this series on the myth of the framework. And it was very Popperian, the attitude that Joe Rogan took. And as David Deutsch likes to say, everyone is Popperian in the area where they excel. And so Joe Rogan is almost a Platonic ideal, pardon the pun, of a Popperian speaker or discusser or whatever you want to call it, interlocutor, because he's just there for fun and to learn.
It's interesting that one of our biggest hurdles is the human ego does not want us to ever be wrong.
Right.
It's a giant hurdle. And human beings, for whatever reason, I guess it's part of the motivation of acquiring information and of advancing your ideas. We attach ourselves to ideas. And one of the things that I always tell young people, like if you want to do better in life and not get tricked by your own bullshit, don't be married to your ideas. Ideas are just ideas. You are not your ideas. Ideas are some things that you explore and you talk about with friends, but you have to always be honest about them and never be attached to them.
Yeah.
The problem with ideas is that ideas are just like everything else. Human beings grab them and they're stingy and they're like, mine, and I want my idea to win. And you'll lie so your idea wins, and it'll advance your career if your idea wins. And if you can, even if you can unfairly dismiss, or you can be unethical in how you're ignoring certain aspects of data for your opposing ideas. Like, people do that and succeed because of that, because academia rewards them, the media rewards them, especially, if they can publish in the New York Times or something like that, like if they can make a story, like you'll get rewarded for lying.
Yeah,
it's awful because we rely on experts.
Yeah.
And a lot of times experts are just like everybody else. They're competing with these other experts and they're trying to get ahead and they're willing to bullshit. And also there's financial reward in bullshitting. There's people that would like them to bullshit a little bit. It'd make it a lot easier for us to pass this thing that we're trying to do. You do a little bullshitting. Like that would be fun to just talk to a person.
Obviously you've spoken to thousands of people for 3-hour chunks. Do you think, had you had the opportunity, you would have been able to pull out 3 hours of worthwhile conversation with her?
I don't know. You don't know until you do it. You know, you don't know also based on people's conversations with other people, because people are different. To some people, they go into conversations like it's an interview, right? And so they can't establish a flow. Right?
Yeah.
A conversation like where you and I are having is a dance.
Exactly.
We're both moving. We're moving. We have to
I actually call it a tango, literally.
It is a tango. It's a tango. It's a dance, and you have to know that. And some people literally are having these things and don't know it's a tango.
Yeah.
They think that it's an opportunity for them to expose people's flaws or catch people in viral moments or an opportunity to flex your intellect. There's a bunch of things. So it fucks with the flow, because as a person listening, I want to feel a genuine conversation. That's what I want.
Yeah.
Right. And you can get that out of almost anybody if they're willing to do it, but that you have to be skillful in how you negotiate it and how you do it. You have to think about it like it's like a dance.
So there's Joe and Gad talking and discussing discussions, as I'm doing here. As I say, no great introduction from me today. Let's get into the readings. The last thing I read was from section 3 of Popper's lecture, where he lingered on the point about what a fruitful discussion is and how discussions can be fruitful. So let me reread that last sentence or two and go on to section 4. Popper wrote, quote, "Fruitfulness in this sense will almost always depend upon the original gap between the opinions of the participants in the discussion. The greater the gap, the more fruitful the discussion can be, always provided, of course, that such a discussion is not altogether impossible, as the myth of the framework asserts." Section 4. But is a fruitful discussion between different frameworks really possible? Let us take an extreme case. Herodotus, the father of historiography, tells an interesting though somewhat gruesome story of the Persian king Darius I, who wanted to teach a lesson to the Greeks living in his empire. It was the custom of the Greeks to burn their dead. Darius summoned, we read in Herodotus, the Greeks living in his land and asked them for what payment they would consent to eat up their fathers when they died. They answered that nothing on earth would induce them to do so. Then Darius summoned the Colossians, who do eat their fathers, and he asked them in the presence of the Greeks, who had the help of an interpreter, for what payment they would consent to burn the bodies of their fathers when they died. And they cried out aloud and implored him not to mention such an abomination. End quote from Popper. So what's he doing here? What's Popper going on about? Well, he's giving us an historic example. Anything might have worked, really, where two parties are very far apart on something. And so it seems as if the discussion or encounter or confrontation is going to be fruitless or pointless. So there's no point in trying to reach agreement. So he's talked there about the Persian king Darius I, who seems, in modern language, to actually be trolling. He's trolling the Greeks who lived in his empire. Just before I get back to that, and I may have mentioned this before on podcasts years ago now, I think. Years ago, I actually read a grand trilogy by a fellow called Valerio Massimo Manfredi, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's based on the life of Alexander the Great, as we know it, with lots of fictional dramatisation. So it's history with drama thrown in. You know, he's imagining what life would have been like for Alexander day to day. Of course, we don't know in huge detail exactly what happened. The records aren't exactly great. Nonetheless, this book by Manfredi about Alexander the Great has some wonderful cameos, for want of another word. People like Aristotle, who was the tutor of Alexander the Great. We encounter him. And also Darius, not the first, but Darius the Third, who in fact was, if I recall, Alexander's main enemy throughout the book, or at least early on before Alexander took over the entire known world. So it was the Darius dynasty of Persia that was the big, powerful empire of the time before Alexander took over the known world, so far as I know. So apparently Darius III's grandfather, I would presume, this is Darius I, he has decided, okay, let's see how the Greeks react to a little game I'm playing here, a little psychological game. They, the Greeks, burn their dead, as most civilisations do, you know, burn or bury. But the Colossians, who Darius also ruled over, they didn't burn or bury their dead. They ate them. I guess raw, because they say they don't burn them. So they're eating their dead raw. In any case, here is a situation where you really do have two opinions that are very far apart, and there seems to be no middle ground. One side is saying, burn your dead. The other side is saying, eat your dead. I mean, on such an emotionally charged issue, can there be a dialogue or a meeting of minds? Can there be a fruitful discussion? And what would be the point in general of trying anyway? Well, simply learning of the existence of such an opinion can be informative. You realise, in such an encounter, that you better watch out when you're out there. Don't take anything like your way of life for granted, because some people might just think that what you do is beyond the pale, when you think it's the most innocent or honourable or sacred or righteous thing to do. Let's see where Popper is going with this. He goes on to write, quote, Darius, I suspect, wanted to demonstrate the truth of something like the myth of the framework. Indeed, we are given to understand that a discussion between the two parties would have been impossible, even with the help of that interpreter. It was an extreme case of a confrontation, to use a term much in vogue with believers in the myth of the framework, and a term which they like to use when they wish to draw our attention to the fact that a confrontation rarely results in a fruitful discussion. End quote. So confrontation is a word I've already used here because I knew it was coming up, and it's a word that Popper is going to continue to use throughout the rest of this piece. Confrontation. It sounds pejorative, and yet what Popper wants to say is when you confront something like almost the polar opposite idea to the one in which you hold, if that idea is deeply held by someone else, that can be instructive. And it can still lead to a fruitful discussion, despite what many tend to think. Remember what it is, this myth of the framework that Popper is criticising. It is the idea that discussion, fruitful discussion I should say, is literally impossible unless the participants share common ground, as it were. The common framework, the common set of assumptions, the common premises or definitions, or whatever it happens to be. They have to share something in common beyond just language, and even then, not so much because we've got an interpreter. That they need to be sharing something before you can have a fruitful discussion, before anything positive can come out of the encounter. That's what is assumed. It's what's still assumed oftentimes today. You hear it, as I mentioned in the last episode, whenever anyone says you shouldn't talk to Putin, you shouldn't talk to Hamas, you shouldn't talk to North Korea. Now, these people, we might agree, some of them are very, very evil. But when the choice is between violence and discussion, perhaps we should try and discuss and to change the minds of these people, or at least come to understand them better, because that's better for everyone. If we can avoid their violent tendencies and avoid them getting violent, it's better all round for everyone. So even when people are so far apart that violence or death is the only other option to discussion, there can still be a fruitful, positive outcome from any confrontation, which isn't violent. Popper goes on to say, quote, "Let us assume that this confrontation staged by King Darius actually did take place, as Herodotus narrates it. Was it really fruitless? I deny that it was. Admittedly, it does not seem that mutual understanding was achieved, and the story shows that we may be faced, in some rare cases, by an unbridgeable gulf. But even in this case, there can be little doubt that both parties were deeply shaken by the experience, and that they learned something new. I myself find the idea of cannibalism just as revolting as did the Greeks at the court of King Darius, and I suppose my readers will feel the same. But these feelings should make us all the more perceptive and the more appreciative of the admirable lesson which Herodotus wishes us to draw from the story. Alluding to Pindar's distinction between nature and convention, Herodotus suggests that we should look with tolerance and even with respect upon customs or conventional laws that differ from our own. If this particular confrontation ever took place, some of the participants may well have reacted to it in the enlightened way in which Herodotus wishes us to react to his story." End quote. So there we have it. What is fruitful about this particular discussion would be the fact that you learn about the existence of some other idea that might never have entered your mind, much less thought could be common in some places. And you might learn to tolerate such differences. Perhaps you might even come to respect them, so long as, of course, those differences aren't such that they are a direct threat to you and your safety and so on. And by the way, Herodotus is sometimes called the father of history, and he lived 450 BC or so, so 2,500 years ago. So he was a historian and a geographer, so a historiographer as they call it. And so he's told this story here of Darius bringing together the Greeks and the Colossians. Presumably they didn't want to talk about their differences, so to speak, thinking that what the other side did with their dead was completely beyond the pale, unacceptable, and something they themselves would not change their minds on. So what's the point? Well, again, learning about the existence of people with ideas markedly different from your own can help to build tolerance. It's a very big thing for Popper, obviously. He detested violence. The shadow of World War II is ever present throughout his work when it comes to anything touching on history or politics or discussion. He knows what can happen very much firsthand when people cease speaking and refuse to be tolerant. But Not so tolerant, of course, as to tolerate intolerance. There's no contradiction there. There's no great paradox. You know, people talk about the paradox of tolerance with Popper. He's just saying you don't tolerate intolerance. Big deal, not a paradox. Anyways, Popper goes on. Let's keep going. Quote, "This shows that there is, even without a discussion, a possibility of a fruitful confrontation among people deeply committed to different frameworks. But we must not expect too much. We must not expect that a confrontation or even a prolonged discussion will end with the participants reaching agreement. But is agreement always desirable? Let's assume there is a discussion and that the issue at stake is the truth or falsity of some theory or hypothesis. We, that is, the rational witnesses, or if you like, impartial spectators of the discussion, should of course like the discussion to end with all parties agreeing that the theory is true if in fact it is true, or that the theory is false if in fact it is false, but only in those cases. For we should like the discussion to reach, if possible, a true verdict. We should, however, dislike the idea that agreement was reached on the truth of the theory if the theory was in fact false, and even if it was true, we should prefer that no agreement is reached on its truth if the arguments supporting the theory were too weak to bear out the conclusion. In such a case, we might even prefer that no agreement is reached at all. And in such a case, we should say that the discussion was fruitful if the clash of opinion led the participants to produce new and interesting arguments, even though those arguments were inconclusive. For conclusive arguments in support of a theory are very rare in all but the most trivial issues, even though arguments against a theory may sometimes be pretty strong." End quote. So here is where I'm going to quibble just a little with the expression, but not so much the substance. And it's also here where I think that David's emphasis objectively improves Popper's way of expressing things. We're going to come to the discussion about the Ionian school of philosophy in ancient Greece and how, rather than faithfully transmitting the lessons of their teachers, instead they altered things and improved them, which is what a rational school of thought, for want of another term when we use this word school of thought, and we'll come back to this idea of a school of thought or a way of understanding things. You want to be able to improve it. So this tradition, or whatever you want to call it, I call it epistemology, but you can call it critical rationalism if you like. It is improved over time. It was improved by Popper. It pre-existed Popper. Popper was certainly the one who really wrote down the majority of the stuff, and then David Deutsch has come along and improved a whole bunch of stuff as well. So anyway, right here, in what Popper has just said, let's reflect on how we might go about improving it in light of the way in which David Deutsch emphasises certain things, and the way in which on Talkcast I tend to emphasise certain things and not other things. Not to deny that truth and falsity exist, they're real, they're important, we need them, but Popper is trying to figure out here, when there is a discussion about whether or not a particular theory is true, and whether our discussions can lead to a place where everyone will agree that a theory is true when it is true and false when it's not. We don't want to go around labelling true things false and false things true. Okay, so that's what Popper says. Fair enough. Our minor improvement here might be to emphasise that we want to be able to agree not on what is true, but rather on which explanation on offer is best, especially when there really is an objectively best explanation out of all the ones on offer. In science, as I often say, we only have one explanation, the explanation. It's called the scientific explanation for whatever the thing happens to be. And it's generally, almost always, if it's a scientific explanation, it's a good explanation. It's hard to vary. And if you want to be rational and you don't understand some scientific theory that might be, let's say, the consensus among the experts in that particular field, but if you want to understand it, you want to come to agree with those experts, with others in the community of scientists or scientifically literate people or whatever, that indeed some theory or other is the best. And you will only agree once you understand it. This is why people have mentors, tutors, teachers, colleagues, professors, favourite YouTubers or whatever you want to call it, depending upon where you are in your spectrum of opinions about how learning happens. If you're not teaching yourself, which is quite possible, of course, especially in this day and age with YouTube, ChatGPT, Grok or whatever else, DeepSeek, although I don't think DeepSeek's very good. The video might not age well if I mention DeepSeek. Maybe very soon you'll be sitting with an AI tutor, or other people will if they want to learn physics or some other area of science or history or whatever it happens to be. Whatever. You want to understand something like, let's say, how an electric motor works. Just, let's say, the basics. Your whole problem is that you want to get to a point where you consciously agree with your tutor or the person helping you to understand. You want to get to a point where you understand what's going on. You're not just saying you agree. You actually agree that when the current goes through the wire, it creates a magnetic field, and when placed in the presence of another magnet, it experiences a force, and this causes a turning force called torque. And this is the basis of how electric motors work. The motor effect, it's actually called in physics. So once you understand all of that, and you understand that you can put many such wires together, and you can put AC current through it, and you get this constant spinning, and you understand that, the larger the area of magnetic flux captured by the loops of wire, and all this sort of stuff can increase the torque. It might take you a demonstration and 20 minutes worth of exposition from your helper, let's say. You get to a point where you have the aha moment, and you go, aha, now I understand how electric motors work. I agree with you, and I agree with the consensus, with the scientific explanation. Now, it may in fact be the case that the theory that you've been taught, or you've come to learn and you understand, may in fact be in some parts wrong, strictly speaking, as well. But everyone involved in the learning, let's say it's you and a proverbial tutor of some kind, you both agree that you understand it, and you agree that this particular theory works and it says something correct about reality. But whether it's literally true or not can be put aside in this case. In almost all scientific discussions, and indeed any kind of discussion about the nature of reality, including discussions about what happened in history, let's say. All of that can be put aside. In our motor example, you can just say something like, what you now understand about motors is the single best explanation that electrical engineers worldwide agree on when it comes to how electric motors work, basically. But Popper here speaks of true verdict, and okay, that's okay. In this terminology, it's just to say that I'm skewing towards that a discussion should lead to a verdict that the theory is the best available when it is the best known and not otherwise. So when the community of scientists discuss, or relevant experts in a particular area or working on a particular problem come together, they don't need to say, okay, well, we agree that this is the true theory when in fact it is true, or false when it is in fact false. You just say, it's the best one, and we've error corrected our way to a better place through discussion. And one other little quibble. Okay, fair enough. What he says right at the end there about there being very few arguments in support of a theory, okay? Arguments in support of a theory rarely being conclusive, he says, but arguments against the theory sometimes being pretty strong. Now, as I've said before, perhaps dozens of times, I don't know, scores or hundreds of times before, you can just say, look, here's the explanation or the theory, and it's the best one. At that point, okay, if there's nothing else known, if nothing else accounts for the phenomena that you're talking about, any amount of support for this theory is utterly irrelevant, because you just have an explanation. So it doesn't matter how much support is accumulated beneath it to hold it up as being the best explanation. It just is the explanation, and more support or evidence in favour doesn't help, because the evidence has, at that point, ruled out all competitors, and the theory itself explains the evidence. And often we talk about evidence as being support, but I think that's just around the wrong way. Once you have evidence deciding between theories, then the theory that survives that process, that critical process, then serves as the explanation of the explicander. The explicander is just a fancy word for the evidence. So once you've got an explanation of a particular phenomena, the phenomena is the evidence, and, well, if you've got no alternatives, then there's no point talking about to what extent it is supported, because it is the only one on offer. What else are you going to do? And as I say, in only very rare cases do you have two competing explanations anyway. And if it's a scientific dispute, so to speak, between two theories, you have to await the outcome of an experiment, a crucial test. Generally, competing explanations, though, are they're just broadly competing explanations. They might not necessarily be good explanations. They're just competing to explain the same thing. They can be refuted, almost all of them, without regard to any experiment. You don't need to perform an experiment. You just refute them on the basis that they're bad explanations. The grass cure explanation, eat the kilogram of grass in order to cure your common cold. Bad explanation because it doesn't give you a cause. It doesn't give you an explanation as to what the active ingredient in grass is, or how grass might actually cure your cold. And if you're saying it's a kilo and you try the kilo and the kilo doesn't work, of course, the person who has prescribed this particular nostrum for you can come back and say, well, actually it's 0.99 or it's 1.01 kilograms. Try that. And they can just continually adapt the hypothesis ad hoc, as we say, without ever giving an account why. An utterly pointless exercise. That's not science. It's science in form only when you're doing experiments like that. The grass cure, the world is going to end next Tuesday. These are falsifiable things. Or God did it, or spontaneous generation, or we're all part of the simulation. All of these things can be rejected on the basis that they are explanationless, usually speaking. And as to when Popper says arguments against are sometimes pretty strong, well, immediately I think here of two things. First, as I say, the crucial test. That is an argument against. The crucial test decides between two theories and will rule against one while being consistent with another. So that's not merely pretty strong, but often absolutely decisive. I mean, there is no other explanation other than that the theory just does not match reality. Think Eddington's experiment. Think Lavoisier ruling out phlogiston theory by showing a gas was absorbed, basically. Lavoisier, by the way, if you haven't studied chemistry, he burned stuff inside sealed containers. On the phlogiston theory, which was the competing theory to how combustion actually works with oxygen, on the phlogiston theory, when you burn a substance, substances get lighter because the phlogiston escapes from that particular substance. It's the flammable stuff inside of a flammable substance, and it escapes off into the air. But on the other hand, on the combustion theory, which is where oxygen is actually used in order to oxidize stuff in the presence of heat, and what you have there is an actual increase in mass rather than a decrease in mass for certain things that are combusted. And Lavoisier was the first one to measure the mass of these things. And if you ever do like high school chemistry, often the teacher will burn something like magnesium. You weigh the magnesium before burning it and you weigh it after. It's heavier after because the magnesium's been converted to magnesium oxide. And you can in fact use that same experiment to determine the empirical formula, MgO, for magnesium oxide, if you're careful enough with all of your measurements. In any case, Lavoisier's experiment of that kind, of burning stuff, is decisive. Okay, it ruled against phlogiston, which claimed substances should always get lighter when burned, and here are substances that actually get heavier when burned. So we can rule out things decisively by recourse to the crucial test, the experimental refutation. And that's the first way. The second way is, of course, that's a bad explanation. Okay, so if you can figure out that something is in fact a bad explanation because it's too easy to vary and so on, like the grass cure thing, you never need to do the experiment. People say the simulation has caused that or something or other. All of these crazy ideas aren't refuted by experiment, and perhaps they can't even be refuted in principle by experiment. But we don't need to waste time worrying about any of that because they're just bad explanations. They don't make any predictions. They don't help us to make progress. They actually achieve nothing aside from being somewhat entertaining for some people. And Popper goes on, quote, "Looking back at Herodotus' story of the confrontation, we can now see that even in this extreme case where no agreement was in sight, the confrontation may have been useful, and that, given time and patience, which Herodotus seems to have had at his disposal, it did bear fruit, at least in Herodotus' own mind. Thus, my thesis is not that the gulf between different frameworks or between different cultures can, for logical reasons, always be bridged. My thesis is merely that it can usually be bridged. There may be no common assumptions. There may perhaps be only common problems. For different groups of humans do, as a rule, have much in common, such as the problems of survival. But even common problems may not always be needed. My thesis is that logic neither underpins the myth of the framework, nor its denial, but that we can try to learn from each other. Whether we succeed will depend largely on our goodwill, and to some extent also on our historical situation and on our problem situation, end quote. Goodwill. That reminds me of actually what Joe Rogan said earlier. People can talk without ever expecting or requiring that they reach agreement. Certainly no expectation of winning or anything like that, because that's never the point to begin with. Expect, if you like, to learn. That's the real win. That is the measure of success in any discussion or confrontation, or call it what you like, encounter. And it can happen if you have goodwill. And this is why I've made a big deal of, and why I think it entails, something I would just call courtesy, politeness, norms, understanding the culture within which you exist, and knowing it so as to know how to have fruitful discussions that don't devolve, where people start feeling slighted or feeling as if they've been done a rudeness, so to speak. And especially online, this is hard for people, it seems. They say and do things they rarely would do face to face. And the thing here is that if you come at someone online, which is where so much discussion happens throughout our world now, of course, one of two things will happen in response to rudeness. And some people say, oh, I'm just being direct, or I'm just being myself. You do you if you think that that's going to work, but often things won't be enjoyable, you're not going to learn, and people are going to have one of two reactions. The first one is, I think, the person who's been done the discourtesy, or been insulted, or whatever it was, just returns the volley. They insult right back, and now it becomes a slanging match. It's a debate of the worst form. Or, the second thing, two, they just retreat into silence. Especially online, it's very easy to become silent. You get blocked, or you get muted, or you simply get ignored. In either case, no progress, no learning happens. I guess Popper might say, although we can't speak for him, but if he existed in the online world, he might very well say that, reading between the lines here in the myth of the framework, that even those such confrontations might not be completely pointless. Each party learns about the existence of another perspective, however poorly it was put. And I might even say, well, at least you learn about how bitter and angry and terrible some people can be, and how awful some ideas are, and in fact that it is just so common for people to get extremely agitated and angry about certain intellectual topics even. You see it among scientists in particular. They're really disappointing. I remember when I was at school looking up to university professors, because I came from a family where people didn't go to university. I was the first one for, I think, parents, cousins, grandparents, all that sort of stuff. And so I had this image of what university was like, and I just thought it was full of these erudite professors engaged in what you saw in movies, where people were just having fruitful discussions all the time. But when I got to university, although I still had the starry-eyed innocence of a person who knew nothing about university apart from just turning up, because no one told me. I didn't have anyone to talk to who had ever been to university before. And so off I go to university and have the experience of gradually beginning to realise that, well, these are just human beings. But now, of course, it's even worse, because so many university professors that I see and scientists that I otherwise used to idolise, otherwise used to think of as heroic figures when I was a school student, and I really wanted to be that kind of person, I realise now are very flawed, and in fact, not merely very flawed, but in some ways worse than the average person. I mean, huge egos, and stuck inside of what I talked about, echo chambers, but stuck inside of frameworks of thinking that are very, very rigid, and they don't want to have the fruitful discussion. They often want to win. They often want to encounter a debate. They often want to have political power and authority, and with their expertise, they think that people must listen to them, all this sort of stuff. And so my opinions, my almost deification and high respect that I had for university professors and scientists and that kind of thing was eroded slowly and then very quickly once, social media especially came around. Social media did horrendous damage to the reputation of the expert class in general. And that's possibly a good thing. Undermine the university system in many good ways, many bad ways. I think that we need universities, but they probably should stick largely to research or radically change the way in which they teach. Myself and Naval and David Deutsch have talked about this at length. Go to the Deutsch files on the Naval podcast to hear more about that. In any case, as I was saying, not all of these terrible encounters that people can sometimes have online and attitudes that they have and ways in which they interact, not all of them can be completely fruitless. You do learn that there are these trolls out there, and what purpose do trolls serve? Well, just to remind you that people are exceedingly irrational at times, and we all are to some extent or another irrational, rather a lot of the time. We would like to be more rational at times, but creativity likely depends or requires us to be irrational in many cases, not consistent. Holding a particular opinion in one mode or frame of thinking and then holding a diametrically opposed opinion, maybe implicitly. Anyway, you do see what used to be called online flame wars. They're the equivalent of shouting matches. Really what you want is to stick to the issues. You want to stick to discussing problems, come to a verdict, to use Popper's term, or at least be able to rationally decide who has a better idea, if anyone does. So I take Popper seriously. You need to have goodwill, but also be under no obligation. Better to just walk away virtually, or in reality if you encounter repeated rudeness or anything that even, it's a much lower bar than that. You don't even have to encounter rudeness. Anything that slightly causes you to sense this isn't fun anymore. Fun is the aim, remember. I would say it's another term for fruitful discussion. And also in many senses, as I say, fun can also be synonymous with learning. We're up to section 5 of the paper, but before I begin it, I just want to read from Popper's own introduction to this entire book, The Myth of the Framework, because one has to smile when they read it in conjunction with what is to come in this piece by Popper. This introduction by Popper to the entire book appears at the beginning under a title, Author's Note 1993, and it says, and this is Popper speaking, I do not regard myself as an expert in either science or philosophy. I have, however, tried hard all my life to understand something of the world we live in, end quote. So you kind of have to smile at that, given his deep knowledge of especially philosophy. But he says he's no expert, or perhaps he just does not like to be called one, and I can sympathise, because he goes on in that very same introduction to write, quote, today it has become fashionable in the sciences to appeal to the specialised knowledge and authority of experts, and fashionable in philosophy to denigrate science and rationality. Oftentimes, this denigration of science and rationality is due to a mistaken theory of science and rationality, a theory which speaks of science and rationality in terms of specialisations, experts and authority. But science and rationality have really very little to do with specialisation and the appeal to expert authority. On the contrary, these intellectual fashions are actually an obstacle to both. For just as the fashionable thinker is a prisoner of his fashion, the expert is a prisoner of his specialisation. And it is the freedom from intellectual fashions and specialisations that makes science and rationality possible, end quote, which is all music to my ears. I wrote something during COVID about authoritative experts, and I had never read this particular thing by Popper before this. People who converge on the truth converge together and all that sort of stuff. It's worth reflecting on. Popper is not a fan of appeal to authority, which is how expertise is often presented. Now, this is not to deny expertise. Expertise is absolutely real. Someone who knows a lot, generally, or almost everything in a particular field, let's say, a very narrow area of specialisation, and it's possible to do that, everything that is known in that field, the best explanations in that field, might be known by the experts, whereas a layperson knows much less, and there's gradations there, of course. The point is, you don't give over your critical faculties, ever, to an expert. You can remain critical. Now, not mindlessly critical, okay, that's never what I'm talking about. I'm not skeptical, not denying that, anyone actually is an expert, just in the sense that you have an explanation of how they error correct and whether it meets your own standards and that kind of thing. Anyways, Popper saying he's no expert in philosophy, I take with a grain of salt. So let's go on with section 5. And Popper writes, quote, I wish to suggest here that, in a way, we ourselves and our own attitudes are in part the results of confrontations and of inconclusive discussions of the kind described by Herodotus. What I mean can be summed up by the thesis that our Western civilization is the result of the clash or confrontation of different cultures, and therefore of the clash or confrontation of different frameworks. It is widely admitted that our civilization, which at its best may be described somewhat eulogistically as a rationalist civilization, is very largely the result of the Greco-Roman civilization. This civilization acquired many of its features, such as the alphabet, even before the clashes between the Romans and the Greeks, though it is clashes with the Egyptian, the Persian, the Phoenician and other Middle Eastern civilizations, and in the Christian era, our civilization was further modified through the clashes with the Jewish civilizations and through the clashes due to the Germanic and Islamic invasions, end quote. That's really important and dense. Now, at the risk of turning off my audience by mentioning these names, I saw Piers in conversation with Tucker Carlson. Now, being an Australian, if you had have asked me about 5 years ago who either of these people were, I may have recognised their faces because, they were on television, probably crop up on pay television here in Australia now and again, but I wasn't aware of them. Now they're both huge sort of names on the internet and whatever. Anyway, I used to think, honestly, they were the same person. They just looked the same to me. Anyway, they were in conversation recently and I thought, let's just see what they're saying. There's not much to recommend either of them, but one of them, Piers Morgan, talks about how he's a Catholic and, he believes in Christ, and Tucker Carlson is a Protestant, and, so they had a meeting of minds there on the wonders of Christianity and whatever else. Never mind that. Tucker challenged Piers Morgan on what defines the West. The West. And they ended up agreeing that what defines the West was Christianity. Christianity explained all the West, and that's really what you're defending. When you're defending the West, you're defending Christianity.
True.
What is Western civilization?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say that, for example, one of the reasons that, the three reasons Trump...
It's Christianity is what it is.
Well, that's, okay. I know you believe that strongly.
Well, okay,
I'm
if it's not Christianity...
I'm a Catholic, you're preaching to the choir, literally.
No, but if it's not Christianity, what is it? It's Christianity. That's what it is.
Completely off base. Now, I do not deny that Christianity has a role in forming the culture of many places in the West. And in fact, there is some good that can be extracted out of Christianity. Not a huge amount, but some. Much of the good stuff that is there in Christianity predated Christianity, both in Judaism and, importantly, in the Greco-Roman civilization, which predated Christianity by anywhere between decades and centuries. So, as one of my philosophy lecturers once said of Jesus Christ, that he was great for a third-rate Aristotle. A little bit mean. But anyway, let's get back to reflecting on what I've just read there about this idea of the clash of cultures, or confrontation between different frameworks, as Popper puts it there. It's a very dense passage that he's written there. But he is saying explicitly that our culture, our civilization, more importantly, our civilization is the result of culture clash. Different frameworks came together and confronted one another, and out of that came a critical method. People had to decide which way is better, had to decide whether this or that culture had a better idea. And from that we got the West, where we just choose the best ideas given an objective standard. What works and so on. What survives the crucial test or the argument. Let's keep on going. And Popper writes, quote, but what of the original Greek miracle? The rise of Greek poetry, art, philosophy and science, the real origin of Western rationalism. I assert the Greek miracle, so far as it can be explained, was also largely due to culture clash. It seems to me that this is indeed one of the lessons which Herodotus wants to teach us in his history. Let us look for a moment at the origin of Greek philosophy and Greek science. It all began in the Greek colonies in Asia Minor, in southern Italy and in Sicily. These are the places where the Greek colonists were confronted with the great civilisations of the East and clashed with them, or where, in the West, they met the Sicilians, Carthaginians, and Italians, such as the Tuscans." End quote. So here we have Popper, that non-expert in philosophy, giving us an in-depth rundown of how Greek civilization made progress. Now I'm going to keep going because this is the truly fascinating part of this particular section. The impact of culture clash on Greek philosophy is very obvious from the earliest reports about Thales, the founder of Greek philosophy. It is unmistakable in Herodotus, who seems to have been influenced by Zoroaster. But the way in which culture clash may lead men to think critically comes out most forcefully in Xenophanes, the wandering bard. Although I have quoted some of his verses on other occasions, I will do so again, because they illustrate this point so beautifully. Xenophanes makes use of the lessons he learned from the clash between the Greek, the Ethiopian, and the Thracian cultures for a criticism of the anthropomorphic theologies of Homer and Hesiod. And here Popper goes on to quote Xenophanes. It's not the famous quote that we often hear. We will come to that. It's something different. So Xenophanes wrote, quote, "The Ethiops say that their gods are flat-nosed and black, while the Thracians say that theirs have blue eyes and red hair. Yet if cattle or horses or lions had hands and could draw, and could sculpture like men, then the horses would draw their gods like horses, and the cattle like cattle, and each would then shape the bodies of their gods in the likenesses, each kind of its own." End quote. So, a couple of things there. Popper will come back to Thales. Who was this guy? Who's this Thales guy? And he's the first of the Greek philosophers. Any student of mathematics also, well, not any student of mathematics, many students of mathematics will know about Thales. He did stuff with triangles, but his most famous theorem was the one many students who go on to do mathematics at high school and beyond. You have to learn how to do that particular proof and then learn the theorem by heart, that the angle in a semicircle is a right angle. You, in other words, draw a diameter, okay, AB, and then pick any other point on the circumference, C. Now join up the lines A to C and B to C, and you've got yourself a right angle triangle. And it doesn't matter where you put that point C on the circumference. If you've got a diameter as one of the sides, the other point on the circumference is always a right angle. Curious. Pretty cool, right? That's Thales. He figured that out first. And as I say, often thought of as the very first Greek philosopher. In other words, one of the so-called pre-Socratics. What he generally did that was remarkable, or what he is known for, that he may have been the first person to have explained things, not in terms purely of just straightforward supernatural mythology, which is what Popper's going to talk about shortly. In other words, Thales wasn't just going to say, the gods did it, and here is how. No, instead he actually tried to do something approximating science, bold conjectures about physical reality. Now, he had that part right, he just didn't have the experimentation bit. No one did. That took a long time to come. And of course, as we've just heard Popper talk about Xenophanes, and in what we've just read, has observed that every culture's got their own gods, and the gods, interestingly enough, always appear to resemble the people whom they are the gods of. So what's the truth about the gods if there's only one kind of god up there creating all life on earth or something like that, or one pantheon of gods up there? Well, if there's anything to be known, then that's true about the gods, all these theories can't be correct. So Popper explains what Xenophanes concluded in that famous passage. Yes, we're going to read it again, and you will enjoy it. Popper goes on to say, quote, "And Xenophanes draws an important critical conclusion from this lesson. He concludes that human knowledge is fallible." And strap in, Xenophanes writes, quote, "The gods did not reveal from the beginning all things to us, but in the course of time, through seeking we may learn and know things better. These things are, we conjecture, like the truth, but as for certain truth, no man has known it, nor will he know it, neither of the gods, nor yet of all the things of which I speak, and even if by chance he were to utter the final truth, he would himself not know it, for all is but a woven web of guesses." End quote. So all is a woven web of guesses. But not all guesses, as I like to say, are equally false. But they're all false in some sense. They're not perfectly true accounts of reality. And I deny one can even speak the final truth. Okay, so I might quibble with Xenophanes as well. Because what could it mean to say the final truth? I don't know. But Popper is going to explain how Xenophanes and others seem to be the first to not only figure out this thing we call conjectural knowledge and how it denies the possibility of certain or final truth, but what it does is draw a bright line between the subject matter and our knowledge of the subject matter. And this is a mantra of mine these days, but I distinctly remember, and lucky for me, actually having an exchange some decades ago now with David Deutsch after I'd read The Fabric of Reality. This is well before The Beginning of Infinity was published. And as usual, being, a university student, undergraduate, I thought I understood something, but actually I didn't, because now I can't remember the exact details of this confrontation, this discussion online as it was, but it was me in some email exchange or other, just unconsciously moving between, interchanging the phrase laws of physics and our knowledge of them in some discussion. It was as if I thought they were the same thing, our knowledge of the laws of physics and the laws of physics themselves. And in my mind, it just didn't seem there was a line or a distinction to be made here. So David Deutsch had to actually spell it out for me. And then I got it. Aha, right. What we discover is knowledge. What's out there in some sense, in some real sense, are the actual laws of physics. That's ontology, by the way. But we guess at them. So there's ambiguity in language we have to be careful of when someone like a scientist or a philosopher, whoever, is talking about, quote unquote, the laws of physics, like the second law of thermodynamics or whatever it happens to be. Are they talking about the ultimate, final, actual laws of physics, or do they mean our knowledge of the laws of physics? Now, this is just a problem with that phrase, the laws of physics, because people can mean one or the other of those things, which are very different things. And of course, as soon as we name something like the second law and we have an explanation like that, or part of an explanation, that's knowledge, that's our guess. And it might be well tested, it might be robust and cohere with the rest of what we know about reality, and there are no known alternatives and all of that. But that's different to, as I say, ontology, actual reality, ultimately what the laws of physics are, which I say we cannot know, but which we can approach in some sense. This is the kind of idea you get from Popper. Popper talks about verisimilitude, closeness to truth. David Deutsch talks about closeness to reality. You're approaching, you're improving, you're error correcting, you're sifting the falsehoods from some small amount of truth that you might be able to get, but you can never state the truth. You just know that it's truer, let's say, than something that you've refuted, or many of the things that have been refuted or are bad explanations and so on and so forth. But there's always going to be error, no matter what you find. And so even there's no such thing as the final truth, because we're fallible. The errors are inevitable because we're fallible. In any case, speaking of ontology, Popper has just quoted Xenophanes again, and he goes on to say about another Greek philosopher, Parmenides. And in fact, he is sometimes called the father of ontology. And of Parmenides, Popper writes, quote, "Although Burnet and others have denied it, I think that Parmenides, perhaps the greatest of these early thinkers, stood under Xenophanes' influence. He takes up Xenophanes' distinction between the one final truth which is not subject to human convention and the guesses, opinions and conventions of the mortals. There are always many different opinions and conventions concerning any one problem or subject matter, such as the gods. This shows that they are not all true. For if they conflict, then at best only one of them can be true. Thus it appears that Parmenides, a contemporary of Pindar, to whom Plato attributes a distinction between nature and convention, was the first to distinguish clearly between truth or reality on the one hand and convention or conventional opinion, hearsay, plausible myth on the other. A lesson which we may say he derived from Xenophanes and from culture clash. It led him to one of the boldest theories ever conceived. Culture clash played an important role in the rise of Greek science, of mathematics and astronomy, and one can even specify the way in which some of the various clashes bore fruit. Moreover, our ideas of freedom, of democracy, of toleration, and also the ideas of knowledge, of science, of rationality, can all be traced back to these early Greek experiences. Of all these ideas, the idea of rationality seems to me the most fundamental. It appears from our sources that the invention of rational or critical discussion was contemporaneous with some of these clashes, and that discussion became traditional with the rise of the earliest Ionian democracies. End quote from Popper. Wow, that's a wonderful, breathtaking part of this entire piece here, where Popper is saying that the pinnacle, the most important of all of these ideas, is the idea of rationality, and by rationality he's equating that with critical ideas, criticism. So we have a clear distinction being drawn by Xenophanes first, and then by Parmenides, that there exists something out there to know, the one final truth, says Popper about both of their ideas. So that thing exists, the one final truth, or reality in other words. We can just speak about reality, and that is the thing no one can know in any final sense, but we can know it conjecturally. The one final truth stands apart from our thoughts about it. It is independent of our opinions and conventions and so on. And often our ideas conflict one with another, so they cannot all be true. And that, by the way, is the distinction between ontology, what is in any ultimate sense, and epistemology, what is known or how we come to know about it and so on. And as importantly here, we need to linger on the fact that Popper is beginning to explain what sets Greek culture apart, what the break was between Greek culture and everything that had gone before. Rationality he equates with critical discussion, which is to say, in modern terms, error detection and correction. After all, what is being done with these critical discussions, with this criticism? Well, it's an attempt to find an error and eliminate it, and thus make a little bit of progress to move past the error. That's rationality, error correction. It is what underpins, as Popper says there, freedom, tolerance, science, and knowledge broadly. This allows for improvement, to move beyond mere myth to something approximating an accurate, to some extent, account of reality. So now we are at section 6, and Popper goes on to say, quote, "One of the main tasks of human reason is to make the universe we live in understandable to ourselves. This is the task of science. There are two different components of about equal importance in this enterprise. The first is poetic inventiveness, that is, storytelling or myth-making, the invention of stories which explain the world. These are, to begin with, often or perhaps always polytheistic. Men feel that they are in the hands of unknown powers, and they try to understand and to explain the world and human life and death by inventing stories or myths about these powers." End quote. So one of the main tasks of human reason is to make the universe understandable to us, says Popper. And this is the task of science. It's also the task of history and morality and philosophy, aesthetics, psychology, and so on and on and on. That's all reason. But certainly science is key. And science, like those other domains, is about storytelling in the first instance. We accept the fact we cannot know the final truth, and therefore, what we produce is misconception or myth. Now, not all myths stand on equal footing. Some are refuted, some are yet to be refuted. Some are good explanations, and perhaps some make accurate predictions and pass tests. Others don't. In any case, this whole enterprise of storytelling or myth-making exists across cultures and has, for the entire time, thinking beings have been around. And so far as we can tell, every culture has had accounts, completely mythical, of unknown powers, gods or spirits or fundamental elemental wills and some such, which causes stuff to happen. We might almost say the seen in terms of the unseen. Now, Thor, not seen, causes the lightning. Apollo or Ra controls the sun, and so on. These explanations are in terms of supernatural powers and governed life and death, among much else. Let's keep going with what Popper had to say about this. Quote from Popper, "This first component, which may be perhaps as old as human language itself, is all important, and it seems universal. All tribes and all peoples have such explanatory stories, often in the form of fairy tales. It seems the invention of explanations and explanatory stories is one of the basic functions that human language has to serve. The second component of rationality is of comparatively recent date. It seems to be specifically Greek and to have arisen after the establishment of writing in Greece. It arose, it seems, only once, with Anaximander, the pupil of Thales and the first critical cosmologist. It is the invention of criticism, of the critical discussion of the various explanatory myths with the aim of consciously improving them." End quote. So it begins with myth-making. That's the conjectural part. And then, if it is to make objective progress, it must iterate or combine this over and again with criticism or refutation. The encounter with reality, or whatever it happens to be, whatever the other criteria we have for making objective improvement. Now, in my view, we can just, in a sense, reduce even criticism to a kind of creativity as well. So it all comes down to creativity, both the myth-making and the criticism. It's all just ideas. It's all just coming up with, whether it's the myth-making or with the criticism, it is us creating stuff. But I suppose we need to have different terms for the wild stabs in the dark that we take, the guesses, and then the method of sifting those into, two baskets of better and worse, so to speak. That's criticism. But it's always important to note, I think, that even the criticisms are guesses we make. For anyone who's new here, let me just sketch that very quickly. We might very well have two accounts, let's say, scientific or not, of what fossils are. On the one hand, certain religious people might say that the Great Flood drowned most life on Earth about 5,500 years ago, according to biblical accounts, literal biblical accounts that some Christians and others believe. Okay, so that explains fossils perhaps, sunken, large creatures that have been preserved in mud. On the other hand, we have an account of very slow evolution by natural selection over hundreds of millions of years. So, which is it? Well, we can do a crucial test, an experiment. An experiment like measuring the ratio of isotopes of uranium in some of the fossils to date them. Radioactive dating, not radioactive carbon dating, but radioactive uranium dating. Now, if we find, as we do, an age for certain fossils of 62 million years ago, we refute the theory that all those animals drowned only 5,500 years ago or so. That's a crucial test. But the test is also a story we tell ourselves. The test has theory behind it. It's an observation, and observations are theory-laden, as Popper likes to say, and so do other philosophers as well, because we have to understand how the test works, what the results mean. All of that needs to be interpreted. Yes, the test is actually a good explanation, but it always remains conjectural, and it was a test created by us, and so on and so forth. So what's really going on here, in Popperian terms, if you like, is the confrontation between three conjectures. On the one hand, millions of years of evolution versus a mere few thousand years of sunken animals versus the results of a test. Now, the evolution explanation, taken in concert with the results of radioactive dating, that test, together, they refute the thousands of years ago Noah's Ark story of the flood. Okay, that was an aside. Let's get back to Popper, who expands on Anaximander presently. So Popper goes on to write, quote, "The main Greek example of explanatory myth-making on an elaborate scale is, of course, Hesiod's Theogony. This is a wild and gruesome story of the origin, the deeds, and the misdeeds of the Greek gods. At first sight, one would hardly feel inclined to think that the Theogony may provide suggestions which could influence the development of a scientific explanation of our world. Yet I have proposed the historical conjecture that a passage in Hesiod's Theogony, which was foreshadowed by another in Homer's Iliad, was so used by Anaximander. I will explain my conjecture. According to tradition, Thales, the teacher and kinsman of Anaximander, and the founder of the Ionian school of cosmologists, taught that the earth is supported by water on which it rides like a ship. Anaximander, the eventual successor of Thales, turned away from this somewhat naive myth intended by Thales to explain earthquakes. Anaximander's new departure was of a truly revolutionary character, for he taught, we are told, the following: there is no thing at all that is holding up the earth. Instead, the earth remains stationary, owing to the fact that it is equally far away from all other things. Its shape is like that of a drum. We walk on one of its flat surfaces, while the other is on the opposite side. End quote. So, just a little bit of background. The Theogony was written somewhere around 700 BC. And it's a long time ago. It had about 1,022 lines, apparently. And it was just basically the origin story of the Greek gods, the Greek pantheon, and Greek mythology broadly. So, why would we find anything scientific there? Well, Popper's going to come to that. Most people know about the Greek gods and the myths surrounding them, from Zeus and Hades to Persephone and Ares and so on. Popper is saying that these stories were the precursor to scientific explanations of the world. And indeed, the first critical cosmologist, as Popper calls him, Anaximander, drew from Hesiod's Theogony, the myth of the gods. He drew certain ideas out of the Theogony, which he used to critique other ideas about the Earth, or indeed the entire cosmos. So we learn there in that previous passage that I've just read from Popper that Thales taught the Earth is supported by water. It floats around on a big body of water, which makes sense if you're in Greece, I suppose, looking out at the Mediterranean. Maybe you know about the Atlantic as well, or some other oceans. You eventually walk far enough and you're going to encounter water, so it appears as if you're surrounded by water everywhere. And so therefore, it seems as if you're floating on a huge body of water. Very well. But Anaximander critiqued that idea by presenting a different one, that the earth is suspended between things which are much further away. As Popper will come to, the problem as Anaximander saw it was that Thales's theory that the earth floats on water or is supported by water just raises the question, what supports the water? And so on. We get an infinite regress. But let's go back to Popper, quoting Anaximander. There is no thing that is holding up the earth. Instead, the earth remains stationary, owing to the fact that it is equally far away from all other things. Its shape is like that of a drum. We walk on one of its flat surfaces while the other is on the opposite side. This bold idea made possible the ideas of Aristarchus and Copernicus, and it even contains an anticipation of Newton's forces. How did it arise? I have also proposed the conjecture that it arose out of a purely logical criticism of Thales's myth. The criticism is simple. If we explain the position and stability of the Earth in the universe by saying that it is supported by the ocean like a ship that is supported by water, then we are bound, the critic says, to explain the position and stability of the ocean. But this would mean finding some support for the ocean and then some further support for this support. Obviously, this leads to an infinite regress. How can we avoid it? End quote. What's really remarkable about Anaximander's idea here of this balancing is that it gets so close to the idea of balanced Newtonian forces. I remember having a physics lecturer who used to like saying things like, physicists get excited when nothing happens because it means all the forces must be balanced. So anyways, how did Anaximander come up with this idea? Well, he came up with it from myth. Remember, his problem situation was explaining the Earth, and the only known theory at the time was from Thales, who was saying, well, the Earth floats on water like a ship. But then we ask, what does the water float on or in? And there begins your infinite regress. How do we avoid it? Well, as Popper goes on to write, quote, in looking for a way out of this frightful impasse, which, as it appeared, no alternative explanation was able to avoid, Anaximander remembered, I conjecture, a passage in which Hesiod develops an idea from the Iliad where we are told that Tartarus is exactly as far beneath the earth as Uranus or heaven above it. End quote. Just quickly, Tartarus is the underworld, and therefore Uranus is heaven above it. So you've got the earth in between those two things. Popper goes on to say, quote, "The passage reads, 'For 9 days and nights will a brazen anvil fall from the heavens, and on the 10th it will reach the earth. And for 9 days and nights a brazen anvil will fall from the earth, and on the 10th it will reach Tartarus.' This passage may have suggested to Anaximander that we can draw a diagram of the world with the earth in the middle and the vault of the heavens like a hemisphere above it. Symmetry then suggests that we interpret Tartarus as being the lower half of the vault. In this way we arrive at Anaximander's construction as it is transmitted to us, a construction that breaks through the deadlock of the infinite regress." End quote. So he has drawn from a myth, a complete myth as it turns out, this idea of balanced forces, so to speak. Okay, not in those words, but it does avoid the infinite regress. Well, unless you ask what supports the heavens above. Presumably, you just take it as axiomatic. That's a fundamental truth. There the heavens are, always have been, and there they will stay. And so too for Tartarus, which again is the Greek underworld. So the earth is balanced equally between them. On the other side of planet Earth, where the Greeks were, where you are, presumably, things, I guess, fall upwards to the underworld. In any case, this is a new idea and a critique of Thales's floating model of the Earth. So what's Popper, Karl Popper, up to himself here? He's trying to explain what set the Greek tradition of knowledge creation apart and what led to the West, or the Enlightenment, to distinguish it from other movements. What leads to progress and so on. In other words, he's conjecturing about the nature of conjecture. And he goes on to say, quote, "There is, I think, a need for such a conjectural explanation of the tremendous step that carried Anaximander beyond his teacher Thales. My conjecture, it seems to me, makes the step more understandable and, at the same time, even more impressive, for it is now seen as a rational solution of a very difficult problem, the problem of the support and the stability of the earth. Yet, Anaximander's criticism of Thales and his critical construction of a new myth would have led to nothing had these not been followed up. How can we explain the fact they were followed up? Why was a new myth offered in each generation after Thales? I have tried to explain this by the further conjecture that Thales and Anaximander together founded a new school tradition, the critical tradition. My attempt to explain the phenomenon of Greek rationalism and of the Greek critical tradition by a school tradition is, of course, again, completely conjectural. In fact, it is itself a kind of myth. Yet, it does explain a unique phenomenon, the Ionian school. For at least 4 or 5 generations, this school produced in each new generation an ingenious revision of the teachings of the preceding generation. In the end, it established what we may call the scientific tradition, a tradition of criticism which survived for at least 500 years and which resisted some serious onslaughts before it succumbed." End quote. So, Greek rationalism is distinguished by being a critical tradition. That is Popper's conjecture. The scientific tradition, he says, is a tradition of criticism. And it is the defining characteristic of a civilization that produces a steady stream of objective knowledge and progress. We've talked about that tradition of criticism a lot here on Talkcasts. Popper goes on in the same vein to say, quote, "The critical tradition was founded by the adoption of the method of criticising a received story or explanation and then proceeding to a new improved imaginative story, which in turn is submitted to criticism. This method, I suggest, is the method of science. It seems to have been invented only once in human history. It died in the West when the schools in Athens were suppressed by victorious and intolerant Christianity, though it lingered on in the Arab East. It was missed and mourned during the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance, it was not so much reinvented as re-imported from the East, together with the rediscovery of Greek philosophy and Greek science. The uniqueness of this second component of the scientific tradition, the method of critical discussion, will be realised if we consider the old established function of schools. especially of religious and semi-religious schools. Their function is, and always has been, to preserve the purity of the teaching of the founder of the school. Accordingly, changes in doctrine are rare and are mainly due to mistakes or misunderstandings. When they are consciously made, they are made, as a rule, surreptitiously, for otherwise changes will lead to splits, to schisms, end quote. So again, the first component is myth-making. Making up stories. But that needs to have a second component added to it to make it a properly scientific or rational tradition. Critical discussion is the second component. Challenging ideas with other ideas, including ideas about tests against reality. But just in general, the clash of ideas or cultures are confrontation, as Popper would say. Again, here he goes into some details about how philosophy has worked and tends to work with people following the leader, so to speak, and preserving the purity of teachings, especially in religious schools, but it ends up making philosophy look very much like religion. But he talks about the Ionian school of philosophy being quite different to all of that, because they're not simply preserving the teachings generation after generation with an eye to keeping them pure and not changing things. He writes of the Ionian school in particular, quote, "Yet in the Ionian school we find a school tradition which carefully preserved the teaching of each of its masters, while it nevertheless deviated from their teaching afresh in each new generation. My conjectural explanation of this unique phenomenon is that it started when Thales, the founder, encouraged Anaximander, his follower, to see whether he could produce a better explanation of the apparent stability of the earth than he himself had been able to offer. However this may have been, the invention of the critical method could hardly have happened without the impact of culture clash, and it had the most tremendous consequences. For within 4 or 5 generations, Parmenides boldly suggested that the earth, the moon and the sun were spheres, that the moon moved around the earth while she was always wistfully looking round for the rays of the sun, and that this could be explained by the assumption that she borrowed her light from the sun. A little later it was conjectured in the Platonic school that the earth rotated and that the earth moved round the sun, but these later hypotheses, due especially to Aristarchus, seem to have been too bold, and they were soon forgotten." End quote. So there we have it. And so it has been in the rational traditions ever since. No one teaches Einstein's work, as we've heard before, as if they are the final, pure, ultimate word that's ever been said on relativity. No, people have improved both the letter of the theory and the way of explaining it over time. We simply know more now. And so too, even with Xenophanes through to Popper and Deutsch and so on, we understand incremental improvement and progress and the ideas of critical discussion Popper is explaining here and now. At the end there, what I just read, he mentioned Aristarchus, who is a truly forgotten hero, forgotten if you are, well, not schooled in the history of, let's say, physics or cosmology, but depending on whether or not you took physics at school or university, you may have encountered him. He was the very first, so far as I am aware, to propose a heliocentric view of the cosmos, even well before Copernicus. And he had details, Aristarchus had details like the Earth went round the sun once a year and spun on its axis once a day, and he even had estimates for the distances to the moon and the sun and their relative sizes and so on, and it was good for the time. He thought other stars were suns. That's amazing, and that they were very distant, and this is why you weren't able to notice them move, which is the parallax effect. Noticeable for closer stars, by the way, in real life, if you have telescopes. It's a method for determining the distance to stars. It's the only direct measure of determining the distance to stars. By direct, I mean where you've got a ruler that you can very carefully calibrate, unlike with other measures of distance that happen on the so-called cosmological distance ladder or astronomical distance ladder. If you want to figure out how far away Alpha Centauri is, for example, the closest star to the sun, and what you do is you take a measurement on the sky of where Alpha Centauri is with respect to background stars in, let's say, January. And then you do the same thing again in June, 6 months later. So the Earth is on 2 opposite sides of the sun at those points, and you will notice that Alpha Centauri indeed appears to ever so slightly shift depending upon the time of year, with respect to the background stars, which are basically stationary. And this is due to parallax, and parallax can be easily summed up by, if you put your finger in front of your face like this, and then close one eye like this, as I'm doing, then close the other eye, and close the other eye, and keep going back and forth like that, what you will notice is that your finger appears to shift with respect to the background. That apparent motion is because of, well, you're looking at it from one eye and then you're looking from the other eye, and so your point of observation, your point of measurement is shifting. And if you move your finger away, further or closer to your eye, and then do that same thing, winking at your finger, you will notice that there is a bigger or larger shift, much bigger if you're close and much less if you're further away. And so this is what astronomers do in order to determine the distance to stars. It's the direct measurement, because we know how far away the sun is. It's 150 million kilometers, so you've got a baseline. And then you have an angle. If you've got a baseline and an angle, trigonometry, you can figure out how far away the star that you're observing happens to be with respect, again, as I say, to the approximately stationary background of stars, which are very, very distant and do not appear to move at all, because the further away something is, the smaller that parallax shift, the smaller the parallax angle, and so on. Okay, so Aristarchus is the man, because he figured that out. He reasoned his way to it. He got it. But it was all too much for people of the time to accept, apparently. And with Plato and Aristotle, among others, on the side of geocentrism, poor Aristarchus' theory was largely forgotten until the Copernican revolution. Let's finish up our readings for today as Popper comes to the end of section 6. Popper writes, quote, "These cosmological or astronomical findings became the basis of all future science. Human science started from a bold and hopeful attempt to understand critically the world in which we live. This ancient dream found fulfillment in Newton. We can say that only since Newton has humanity become fully conscious of its position in the universe. All this, I suggest, is the result of culture clash, or the clash of frameworks, which led to the application of the method of critical discussion to myth-making, to our attempts to understand and to explain the world to ourselves." End quote. End of section 6. We'll be on to section 7 next time. But here we've heard it. We've heard the origin story of science, the bold and hopeful attempt, writes Popper, to understand critically the world in which we live. And only since Newton, he says, have we, the members of humanity, become fully conscious of our position in the universe. Well, I would quibble with the use of the word fully. We don't need to put that in there. I don't think we're ever fully there. But in any case, all of this was due to a clash of frameworks or cultures over time as people tried to figure out what was true about reality when their stories about it competed one with another and clashed one with another. So the beginning of the critical method, the way of figuring out what is a better versus worse explanation, the way of detecting and correcting errors, of encountering problems, creatively conjecturing solutions to them, and making just a little progress now and again. That will do for now. Until next time, bye-bye.